In the age of social media, the question is, what is the journalist's role? And if you're as old as I am, or if you can imagine being even older, years ago we would see news commentators come on at a very particular time of the evening, usually 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock or so forth, and they would literally report the news. And now, with the access that we have to them through social media, but now through blogs and comment board, Facebook and Twitter, we just feel closer to these individuals who have become more commentators. And so this is a question: how much of themselves are infusing into the news? Some people like this because they feel closer and have more greater accessibility to these journalists. Some people feel that maybe we're no longer getting clean news, so to speak. It's no longer just the facts. It's now the facts couched within context of individuals and their opinions. So where are we in this, and how do we navigate these channels as we try to understand it? This is all working up to the Schilling Lecture this year. That lecture will be given by my friend Scott Simon, who's the host of National Public Radio's Weekend Edition. And he is a wonderful individual who is both a journalist but also a commentator. And for those of you who are on the Twitter universe, and again, I'm just a baby in this thing, maybe some of you actually watched the huge headlines that he caused as he was literally tweeting about the final days of his mother's life. And to read those things literally in real time, I found them to be extremely stirring. And the fact that he was sharing them with, millions of people was quite thought-provoking. That's all the context for what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. Let me quickly introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Bob Bednard from the Department of Communication Studies, Danielle Stapleton, who is our new media person in University Relations, and in fact, she's going to be trying to do some stuff live on Twitter, and we'll see if that works or not. Tyler Pratt, a graduate from 2012, was a communications studies major who now works at KUT. Paige Duggins, student leader and editor of The Megaphone, and Nathan Tuttle, who's the president of Student Congress. Please welcome our panelists. I asked them each to just open up with some reflections to get the conversation rolling, and we're going to start with Paige. Paige, please.
So glad that y'all joined us today. This is a topic that is so important. Actually spent a whole conference over the weekend learning about journalism and social media from some of the most prominent players in that field. So I'm really happy to be here. Throughout the conversation, I'm happy to answer questions about the megaphone specifically. We've had a lot of interaction with all of you guys through social media, and we've actually been able to incorporate that into our coverage in the megaphone. As most of y'all know, sometimes it's been really positive. Sometimes we've had some lessons to learn from that. And so I think overall we've learned that it's so important. The lesson that I've taken from all of this is that everyone's a journalist. Every time you tweet, every time you post, every time you write a blog, you are documenting history. And as Dr. Berger said, sometimes it's more personal than we'd like. Sometimes it's irrelevant, as I know, what you had for breakfast in the morning is not so important. But everything that you say matters, and increasingly it's being included in the national dialogue that we have about our daily lives. What I really think is important to emphasize, though, in the changing face of social media and journalism is that the core values of journalism should remain the same. I just heard a wonderful talk by Ms. Margaret Sullivan, who's the public editor of the New York Times, and she emphasized that in this changing landscape, the values of journalism, including ethics, integrity, checks and balances on power, all of those things are so important. And as all of us are journalists, it's important to adhere to those when we report. So whenever you say something, you make sure that it's true. And whenever you comment back or you provide feedback, you make sure that it's balanced. And personally, I think it should always be in the pursuit of justice. And so that's what we do at the Megaphone. That's what I do. I'm kind of a baby also in social media. I prefer the laying out and the design. I love newspapers, but I'm really excited to grow in this new field. And like I said, I'm happy to take questions about how the Megaphone is growing and also any experience with that. So
great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nathan.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm glad to see everyone. I sort of feel like the least qualified person on this panel because I don't have any sort of a role in producing social media, but as Paige said, I guess in some ways we're all journalists. And so, although I did recently get to be the Instagram captain, so that was fun for Southwestern. So that was cool. But, in Student Congress, I think we've thought a lot about how do we reach out to people, how do we get in touch with what are the issues, how can we best address those issues, and we're still learning, and so I'm certainly open to any sort of suggestions, and I'm excited to see where this conversation takes us. Now, as far as Scott Simon, I knew a little bit about him as the host of Weekend Edition on NPR, but I didn't know a whole lot about the incident with his mother and tweeting that, and I wasn't sure what I was going to think when I opened up those tweets, but I actually found it to be really emotional and like really inspiring and powerful, which is not things that or words that I usually associate with people's tweets necessarily. So he comes across to me as just a very accessible human being, somebody who's like made himself vulnerable, and I want to know who I'm getting my news from, and I feel like I know Scott Simon in some ways, and I think President Berger raised the issue. Is our news still clean? I don't know if it was ever clean. Maybe we're just getting more of it. So, I think all of those things were also good for him too. That he was reflective through the process too. At one point, he said, "Holding my mother's hand, why did I ever stop doing this? Because it was considered unmanly. What crap." So for him personally, it was a productive and reflective exercise as well. So not only for his audience, but what it meant to him, and I think that that's something worth discussing. So.
Great. Thank you. Tyler, please.
Hey guys, I'm Tyler. I'm a host and producer at KUT and KUTX, and I also do music news for both stations. My experience with social media has always been I always feel a little bit like a newbie when it comes to it. I've grown up with it, and I'm sort of evolving with it all the time, and Facebook was my outlet for a long time, and when I got involved, when I graduated, I started doing morning news over at KUT, and so I was looking for news at 4:30 in the morning, and nothing is published. So you go to Twitter, and that was a marvelous resource for looking for news. And which I should say that journalism is a wonderful career if you like social media because you spend your entire day on it. You have an excuse to be on Facebook when you're at a computer. No one will ever question it. But those were wonderful resources, and when I started doing music news, Twitter was a great resource, and then as I broaden my scope and things that I report on, I have to look even deeper because by the time that it's coming to Facebook or to Twitter, it's already been someplace else. And it's hard to be there first. In this age of journalism, we're almost to a point where it's who did it first. And a great source is Reddit, and it confuses me so much still. But I get on there, and it's a wonderful source for looking for stuff. So basically, my phone is my absolute life. I had to buy a battery pack to keep it alive all the time because as a journalist, this is your absolute best friend. You see, your White House correspondents, anyone who they're tweeting things before they're even happening, before they even get a chance to write about it. It's already out there. It's who said it first. It's who made the comment. So one thing that has also been important about how I use social media now is as I have broadened my career and who I write for and who I work for, it's come to my attention that I need to build my brand, and it happened very organically. And social media is a wonderful outlet to do that. However, it's very scary when you're building your brand. It says, who am I? What do I do? So everything that you say counts and matters and is important, and you're judged on it. And so when I started, I used to just, stay very clean and simple, and I would say things that were happening at the station and wanted to be a representative of the station, and not very much success in that. People really want to see who you are. And so you have to edit yourself, but be honest. And so if there's a really great photo of something out that I'm doing, I tweet that out. If I saw something, send that out. People want to be engaged with you. Is that right? I don't know. But I have seen more success in building my brand and things that I do and how I interact with people and the more honest that I am. And people access that through social media. So I'm happy to take any questions that you guys have.
Thanks. Danielle.
Hello. So I'm Danielle, as Dr. Berger introduced me. I work in university relations, and I oversee all of Southwestern's social media presence. So as a quick explanation as to what y'all are seeing here, we are using a service that crowdsources tweets based on criteria that I've put into the system. So we're seeing tweets from the panelists here, as well as our upcoming Schilling speaker. I'm fascinated by this technology because I think it is representative of what's happening to journalism, which is we're crowdsourcing things. As Tyler mentioned, there is no one person in charge of information anymore. It's who gets there first. It's who takes the best picture. And I'm not exactly a journalist, but I'm a storyteller, which I think most journalists would say that's what their role is. Their job is to tell a story. And so I am in the role of telling Southwestern's story, and most importantly, doing that in an authentic manner. And I think that as social media has become part of journalism and the ways that things are reported on and shared, that authenticity factor has come up to the top as something that news stations, radio stations are valuing and finding is more important to their followers and their consumers than sometimes accuracy. I don't think that's necessarily right. So sometimes authentic doesn't always mean accurate, but we can get into that. So as somebody who manages for an organization, I really appreciate hearing firsthand stories, and being able to share them with tools like this makes it even cooler because it allows y'all to do the same and to see other people's perspectives on a story, and gives you almost a more complete story. So I think as a consumer, I'm often faced with some of the things that Nathan mentioned. I'm interested in watching how the 24-hour news cycle has changed because of social. How often do you see CNN putting a screenshot up of Twitter now? Instead of having a reporter live on the scene, they go straight to Twitter and find the first thing they can find. And I ask myself, is that good or bad? And I don't think there is an answer for that yet. And so I'm really personally intrigued to hear what the folks at this panel and how you guys as users and consumers see that. I also find it interesting to see what the definition of news is and how that's been changing, because sometimes it's what's most popular on Twitter. Whether or not that's actually something we need to know about isn't necessarily the case. So I think it's really fascinating to see how it's transforming and changing how we consume the news and how we participate with the news, which didn't always used to be an option. So look forward to questions and comments.
Great, thank you. Bob, please.
Hi, welcome. And I first wanted to say thank you to Cindy for helping to put this together, and then also Val Reniger, who was instrumental in getting the initial idea off the ground as we were putting this together. I'm gonna, as the resident media scholar, I'm gonna geek out for a little bit here and talk about some concepts that I see here. And I want to basically split it into two things that I see when I look at Scott Simon and when I think about this question of journalism in the age of social media. And that's this idea of the citizen journalist, but also the idea of the journalist citizen. And it basically goes in two different directions. One, let me establish this concept. If you know classic book, Irving Goffman, Presentation of the Self in Everyday Life, he's got this distinction between how we perform our identities on the stage and on the backstage, where there's this idea of our private self and our public self. But he's also got this really intriguing middle stage that has become more and more important to how I think about contemporary society, and it's called the staged backstage. And this is how I see social media, particularly how I see Scott Simon's work with his mother, where, and I heard Tyler just say it too, you're edited, but you're honest. You're putting yourself out there, but you're not putting all of yourself out there. It's a really interesting state of mind because it's where all of us are as we enter the realm of social media, where we're compelled to share, but not everything, where we get in trouble for sharing too much, where we get in trouble for not sharing enough. Those happen for everyday people, but what's interesting for the profession, and I know Tyler already talked about this, is that it's written into contracts now that journalists will be compelled to share themselves. It's part of your professional job now. And they can't stop sharing. They keep talking to us. But it's that sense that you must, not just that you can, but that you must share, that also is a much larger cultural phenomenon that I'm very interested in. And so in terms of the other context I want to just briefly mention is this all also takes shape in a larger universe of journalism where we're not necessarily talking about reporting, we're talking about meta-commentary. Everybody commenting on the same thing at the same time, and that develops its own culture that also compels us to add our voice. And so what it all adds up to me is lots of different voices coming from lots of different directions that the culture is still sorting out. And this is a very interesting time to be asking these questions. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing how you guys articulate your questions and seeing how the panel discusses it. So thank you for coming.
Great. Thank you all. So, I mean, I heard some really interesting things here. Everyone's a journalist. I want to know my journalists. Building your own brand. What is the definition of news? We're all storytellers, and the idea of the staged backstage. Really interesting, thought-provoking. One thing that let me start off the questions, and I'm hoping that you will have questions that you'll want to share with us, but let me just to kind of start it off. I want to know, in the age of social media, and at the very end I want to come back even to that phrase, and we're thinking about journalism, are these issues actually new issues, or have they always been with us, but now we're just being bombarded with it at such a fast rate that it's more noticeable? I was on a panel recently on actually a similar topic about how people are delivering news through social media. And all of a sudden, this woman in the audience said, well, in fact, I actually don't look at any of the social media stuff because I get it from the original source. And so someone on the panel said, and exactly what is the definition of original source? And she said, the New York Times. And then, people on the panel had to explain that, in fact, that is a filter through which we are getting information. So let me ask the group, or whoever wants to kind of chime in here, is this really a new issue? I don't want to say a new problem, but a new issue, or is it really just an issue that's always been there since the early ages of communication, quite frankly, but now it's just more obvious? Who would like to just respond to that in their own context? Yeah, please. Paige.
So every morning I wake up and I sit in bed for about 10 minutes and I look at Facebook and Twitter. And so I see all these posts. I follow all the major news publications. I follow a bunch of really interesting people.
Can we put it on mute?
Yeah, that's what
and that way we can have all the videos we want and distract people, but not get the actual we don't know how to do mute.
The whole computer.
We'll learn.
Just the...
All right, go ahead. Paige.
That's fine.
Sorry.
No, but we just run into all these different forms and outlets of news. And so I think that even though everyone's a journalist and there's all these different opportunities to learn things, I do think that the filter matters. I think that getting something from the New York Times is much different than getting something from, say, The Onion. I just got an email the other day of someone freaking out. It was some ridiculous story on The Onion about the Russian coordinator for the ring that didn't open up and that they died. And I was like, that's not real news. And so I think that it's still really important to differentiate sources and to be able to look with some form of literacy at our news outlets and be able to have judgment about what's credible and what's not.
So in some sense, I mean, what Paige is saying is that we actually are responsible for vetting where the information's coming from, whether it's the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, or someone's tweet, that in some sense we have to be active participants in how we exchange information. Other people want to chime in and say something?
Well, I think that this question of how much of it is new is really important, because if you look back to the golden age, right, where you had 3 TV stations, and it's not that golden. It's a lot of control on what people saw. There was a lot of separation between the producers and the consumers of news, and yet there was still this sense that you had a letter to the editor. There's analogs in this. There were editorials, op-ed pages. It's just expanded so greatly and distributed so much that it's qualitatively different now. That you can look through the history of it and see the antecedents, but I think that we're dealing with something that is qualitatively different.
And to pick up on Bob's point, and he knows this better than I'll ever understand it, but even if you go back in history to those 3 channels, there are historians that report that it was when Walter Cronkite came out and began to speak of the Vietnam War, not as reporting the news, but with a slightly more editorial sense to it, that LBJ thought, I've lost this, battle within the media and within the United States when he heard. And so there, already we're seeing, and I'm sure it was far earlier than just the TV, where the media actually has an impact on how leaders lead.
And just to quickly contextualize that, the reason that LBJ knew that is because he knew so many people were watching Cronkite. If one, that's the difference now, is if one person has that response, we don't know whether anybody saw it, but to qualify that, we do know it's going to get viral very quickly. If there's something like that, it distributes instantly throughout the channel.
Just going off of that, I just had this conversation the other day about editorializing in the news, and I feel like there's this sort of ideal world where we want journalism that is completely objective, just the facts, and we hear this all the time. I'm sure you've heard, Fox News is super biased and not objective, and same thing goes to the Huffington Post, but none of them are. I mean, every single news outlet is editorialized, or no one will read it. What's important are the facts, and you have to sort of take a moment and educate yourself to understand if they are the facts or not. But every news outlet, I think that's what it's done, is it's just compounded. There's even more opinions out there, and now it's finding whose opinions match up with yours, and then whose you're willing to read without getting really angry.
And just to pick up on Tyler's point, whose opinion that resonates with us, and then who do we actually follow, whether it's Twitter or whatever. The truth is that when you're watching Netflix or you're on Twitter, you are self-selecting. So are you getting kind of random news, or news that would be thought-provoking, or news that might actually argue against what you believe, or is it all kind of filtered into your worldview? And so is it skewed in that direction? I mean, you could be on Twitter and be a conservative, you could be on Twitter and be a liberal, and then the only thing you will see will be those opinions and not the other side. And how important is that, or maybe that's not important at all?
Yeah, exactly. I would just say, what does your feed look like?
Let's open it up and get some reactions, comments, and questions from the live studio audience here that's tweeting away potentially.
I think it's a really interesting question, because I'm still continuing to build a following and hate myself for saying that I'm building a following, So it's an interesting concept, and I feel like I was still a newbie, but just a fine journalist when my Twitter was just like some funny things that I tweeted, and like I had 5 people following me, But now as I'm slowly building and I'm understanding and trying to have a network of things that I can get on there and see a variety, I don't know that it makes you a better or worse journalist depending on whether you have a Twitter or not. I do think that it makes it more difficult. And if that's something that you're willing to overcome and can work with, then more power to you. This is the age where everyone's a journalist and everyone can do it yourself. And even more so now, and especially so now, anyone can do this. It takes a lot of drive and it takes a lot of work, and you have to get yourself out there. And so a great avenue is Twitter. Is it the only one? No.
Someone else.
Well, to answer your question specifically about connecting with audiences, just read a crazy statistic that there's this underground thing called Black Twitter, and apparently people from minority backgrounds actually use Twitter more than people from white backgrounds. And I think that's really interesting, and I think that in terms of connecting, absolutely, as a journalist, I think it's really important to get that real-time feedback. I've seen so many exchanges where a prominent news anchor will post something, and then someone in the mainstream will call them out and say that's not true or that's not right. And I think that's an access that you don't normally have. It's much different than waiting for the next day or a week for a letter to the editor, and it's so limited. I think that those corrections and that dialogue in real time is so important for shaping the dialogue and for enabling progress. And so definitely, I think as a journalist in these days, I'm 22, I have no experience in the real world of journalism, but I don't know how it would be possible, and I think it's too good of a resource to pass up.
I also want to add to that. I also think I read that article on Twitter. So,
There you go.
but I remember when Paul Walker died, and I suddenly became very obsessed with Paul Walker, and I had to find out if it was the truth. And I got to Twitter, and it was frustrating. And I found myself wanting to know, can I just find a news source that is dependable so I can find out if he died or not? Which also goes into a whole other topic of sensationalism in journalism. But that was an instance where Twitter was untrustworthy. You search hashtag Paul Walker and you get everything, and you don't know what to believe, and you're trying to track it down. So it actually does a disservice. And you see this all the time in different avenues, especially death hoaxes and different things like that.
And Bob, let me ask you a question following up on the responses to Dee's. How are we supposed to filter? I mean, years ago, when people are actually studying the field, whether it's communication studies, journalism, and so forth, they know what news is, what facts are, and so forth. Now, all the Twitter accounts that you're seeing screaming here look all the same. They look all as professional, the same beautiful font. And so how are we supposed to navigate what is true and what's not? I can just put a declarative sentence up there, but it could be false. Right. But because my Twitter looks professional, you believe it's true. How do we navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where you look for the larger context. So if you make the analogy to a reporter saying something or writing something in the New York Times versus the megaphone, and I'm the advisor, so I get to diss on the megaphone, that there's a different level of authority just from the context within which that is published. That goes away with Twitter, except for the fact that you have this whole system of followers. And somebody like Scott Simon has 1.3 million followers. That means that people trust him to deliver something to them. And I think that's what it's coming back to, and I think this is exactly what Tyler was talking about earlier about the personal brand, is that without editors, without gatekeepers, without institutions, we're looking at individuals now because they are all speaking directly through the channel. And so then it becomes this personal brand. I am this person who is trustworthy, or I would say for Scott Simon, he's a really interesting guy. I think if you start following his ideas, he's a very independent thinker, doesn't want to be put in anybody's box, and he likes pushing that, but that's what he's known for, and that's his personal brand, that he's going to cut through the crap and tell you what he sees it being. And so you go to people like that, and you basically set it up like, these are the people that I'm going to listen to, just like I heard with Tyler. I'm not going to trust just anybody when I'm looking to find out, did this happen or not? And I think that's a real important point about this.
Thank you. Other questions?
You don't even want to get me started on music reviews. So, but I mean, and so that's an example of completely editorializing something but people go to a trusted name. People go to the, Peter Travers, a Rolling Stone, because he is a name. I don't even know what Peter Travers looks like, but I've heard it enough that I'm going to actually put some weight into what he says, and it's going to affect like how I go see a movie or different things like that. But when it comes to like sort of music news or whatever, you just have to, I have to look at what other people are sort of writing a lot of times. And what my job is a lot of times I'm reporting things fresh and it's my story. And then a lot of times I'm just sort of piggybacking off of somebody else's story and trying to add one other thing to it. And so it depends on the outlets, and as I do this, I know who they're, okay, so what, if it's sorry, getting my thoughts together. If it's a thing about city council and a music ordinance or something like that, then I look who's writing it, then I look who they talk to, and I looked what they're referencing. And because I'm knowledgeable enough to know that probably all three of those things happening, I can just assume that it's the truth. But I don't know about anybody else. Most people don't know when city council meetings are, or when the music office meets, or different things like that. But if somebody else has gone to that and reporting it, I guess I just sort of assume that it's true. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, Twitter is the ultimate soundbite. It's 140 characters and that's it, and people are getting their news that way, and we're not getting the richness of the details. Is that a bad thing, Daniel?
I think it just means that as consumers, we have to be more active in the process. Of course, not everybody's going to be, and that's where you get into the polar extremes that you see on, we mentioned political sides of things. You can choose what you see and consume. Yeah, it's a lot of noise, and I think that's, as a consumer, it's what you choose to follow, and that I advocate everybody always look into it. I don't care if it's a front page story on the Austin American-Statesman. If you're not sure, you should dig. It doesn't matter if you've got 140 characters or a whole full page. I think that as somebody who writes, for Twitter and has to think that way, I think of the tweet as the headline, and it has to be something that gets somebody to click through for more. So I think it's how the person's crafting it. You can kind of tell if they don't link to anything. I think it is that sensationalism. They want to get it retweeted. They want to get just that portion out because that's their agenda, if you will. But if you're really looking to educate somebody on a topic, then use that wisely and push them to more information and let them dig deeper. That's just my philosophy and how I think about publicizing Southwestern news and things like that. It's entice them to go and dig further.
Yeah, and I think that it's really easy to just read headlines now. You mentioned Reddit, and that's a website that I'm on more than I'd like to admit. But I've scrolled through and seen news headlines and things like that, and just been like, oh, I want to go look at the funny picture, so I'm just going to read the headline and keep going. And there's a mental note, and so, but that short headline sort of is my whole view on the issue. And I've heard that, I've heard people bring up current events like in Dr. Snyder's international politics class that were word for word headlines from Reddit, but no substance, which I think is interesting. That all of a sudden we're experts because we saw a headline. I'm guilty of it too. So.
I think that we all have those moments where we remember where we were when something happened, whether it was something amazing or something terrible. I learned about Sandy Hook because New York Times sent me a push notification, and I learned about, I'm way more connected to the world now than I ever thought I would. I couldn't, probably 2 years ago, probably couldn't tell you where Ukraine was, to be honest. But now I think that there is a fine line. There's a balance between how quickly the news can go by, but also the advantage of being able to get more of a global community perspective. And I think it really does promote a kind of solidarity among people. People are, when you have those one-line headlines that are so powerful that can engage you to learn more, it can be really, really galvanizing for a community. I've seen the GoFundMes that have been going around on social media, people getting crazy amounts of money because of a share or a retweet, people sending aid, people just having dialogue. 10 years ago, I don't know that I would have had a conversation in the lunchroom about what's going on in Russia. But because it's so present and because it's so prevalent in our Twitter feeds and our Facebook feeds and on the news, I think there's a real opportunity for learning and growth. And so definitely, it's a huge part. Maybe Nathan, he studies sociology, can tell us more about the actual connection to social movements. But as a journalist, I think it's super important. I would say absolutely, and Dr. Berger touched on that. I'm guilty of it. I have friends from high school who I unfriended them because I didn't like what they were posting about President Obama. And so that's a filter in itself. But I think that we've all talked about personal responsibility. And I think that as a journalist, foremost, I have a responsibility to be connected. But I think as American citizens, as people who want to know about the world, it's your responsibility to follow multiple outlets and to get multiple perspectives. It's really the only way to live, in my opinion. So I think that, sure, you should definitely follow the people who inspire you and the people who you tend to agree with. But as Dr. Berger said, you should also follow people who challenge you. If anything, because you're supposed to keep your enemies closer than your friends. So.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
This is something that I recently spoke about with a colleague of mine the other day, is that as my beat has slowly become more and more music-based in what I do, that has become what I look for in the news every day. And I work on a different side of the station, and my Facebook feed is sort of aims itself in a very creepy way into the people that are closest to me and different stuff like that. So when there was the gay marriage was struck down in San Antonio. It's a topic that's, it's important to me and I care about. But I had no idea that that was happening. And that really freaked me out for a second, because that when I used to be more on the news side and I was an intern and I was working and researching everything, I felt like I knew everything that was going on. But now I've isolated myself in a sense because of what I do. And all of a sudden I was like, where did this come from? But if I had been reading up on it. So yes, I do think that social media also makes it very easy to isolate yourself, where before we were getting our news, whether it was totally honest or not, from just a few sources, and that's where we went. Now there's just a multitude now, and so at the same time, you can't isolate yourself.
You want to answer that?
I was just going to say, I think the fact that you talk about Facebook predominantly, and this so far we've been focused on Twitter, I think considering your platform is absolutely essential when you're looking at your source, because quite honestly, Facebook controls what you see. You think you're in control, but they choose what comes up on your feed. And so you may have friends talking about the polar opposite of your political spectrum, but you're not seeing it because Facebook's looking at your keywords and assuming you don't want to. So I think we have to, it just goes back to being your own, you have to dig and you have to be your own journalist and really look for the facts on both sides. And you're right, it's our civic duty, I think, to inform ourselves about all perspectives. But I just thought it was interesting. You predominantly talked about Facebook, and it's Twitter, thankfully, so far right now, doesn't do that for you. Of course, you're going to get promotions, and I think that's one other interesting aspect to social that's starting to change journalism and what we see and consume. It's, well, if you paid enough, as many people as you want are going to see it. So then who has the power? I think that's just an interesting.
I wanted to try to bring these two together because to go with the Ukraine example and also the Lou Reed example to remember what happened when Wendy Davis was doing her filibuster. Mm-hmm. How many different ways that news got to me, and how compelled I felt to follow that in real time. And that was the kind of thing where you could see that somebody who does not tapped into progressive politics would never have even known this was happening. And then as soon as you are, it seems like, well, of course, everybody knows what's going on. And then you start to talk, what are you talking about? I didn't know what is happening to you? People that are in the Capitol, on the phone with me, talking about what's happening, doing live feed, everything like that. It's become a very important means for social movements, as well as a means of representing social movements. And I think that's been the major role that we're seeing unfold right now.
I wanted to touch one more thing, and I think that Bob can probably expand on this, as this is expertise, but as we talk about how social media defines us and what we look at, I think it's also worth thinking about the fact that millions, if not billions of dollars have been spent to make sure that that defines us and that we use these platforms. If you look at what everything that Facebook has done, from the font that they use to where everything is located to the little red dot that sort of fires up your serotonin in your head every time you see that, These things are all designed to keep us there and using them, which raises just sort of an interesting thought process that I'm sure you could talk for hours about with visual communication, that we're using them, but are they using us?
Do a quick run on that with the Ukraine, that especially if you're getting that in really small 140 character blips, you're getting it within the framework of Cold War politics, of the way we think about Russia, the way we think about what should happen in Ukraine, and it's all encoded in very deep ways in word choice, especially given the constraints of that form. And so it self-selects both in terms of who's getting what, but also who's writing what, and how the form itself constrains that. But yeah, I think that the silos are there, and this is there. But there's lots of ways across those silos that weren't there. And I don't know whether anybody actually watched the news back in the golden day. We felt compelled to. I remember that as a kid. Like, you're supposed to read the paper, but I did because I was a paper boy, not because I wanted to know it, And so there's a lot to that, but I want to open it up.
I see a different side of socializing on Facebook that doesn't happen sometimes in the real world. It bridges miles. It bridges a physical, limitation that we have, and to see alumni and students connect, alumni that live in other countries connect with our current students here, I think that's a whole different type of social that we could not have had before this. And so it's definitely a double-edged sword. I'm not saying that this, his research is wrong by any means. I'm sure there's problems that we can't even see yet. But I think we also have to acknowledge that it has a very positive side. I'm going to mention one more example relating to Southwestern about this, but every year the first years have a Facebook group, and they come in to this school knowing each other. They have connected in a way that I never did with anybody before I stepped foot on this campus in the fall of 2001, and they have friendships that are forged, over the summer. And it's a really, really fascinating thing to watch, and something I think is a blessing in a lot of ways for this community in specific. So.
Yeah, the question, though, is the side effects, and you didn't start when you were 6 months old.
I did not, no.
You said you started in the 2000s, and so the question is, what are the long-term side effects? But you're absolutely right, of course, the power of it is huge, otherwise it wouldn't be popular. But are there long-term side effects that you don't appreciate because you didn't experience it? That's the interesting question.
Well, and I think just from as somebody who studies media from a cultural perspective, the larger question always for me is that these new technologies and new platforms make us think differently about what the social is. And I think that's what I'm hearing from in both of these, is that it's not that it's not social, it's just not social as people who grew up in a different world without this come to think social is. And I think that's the key thing for us now, is that looking at these technologies, thinking about what it means to be a journalist, what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be a participant in a collective, in a society, is all under revision right now. And it makes it really exciting to study it, but it also makes it maddening to live in it. And I am one of those who has, I have a 12-year-old and a 9-year-old. I am I'm proud always to say I've never been on Facebook, and I will not be on Facebook. And that's my own thing. But that's part of what we have a choice within. I have a choice within that, because my social life is not based on it, because I had one before that.
About anonymity. Why don't we just go right around the group there? This will be our final thought people will share. Okay. Why don't you start?
I think I can touch on both of those real quick. To answer your question, I think it's exhausting. This morning I needed to get on my email, and I had to take a second to sort of get myself ready, because I'm in the middle of South by Southwest, and I hadn't really entered the digital world, and so I had to brace myself and get ready for what I knew was going to be a flurry of life or death emails. So I would say that it's sort of exhausting, and that to be involved in all those aspects. And to touch on your point of anonymity, one thing that I've been looking at recently, and not sure exactly what my fully formed opinion is, but I've been reading about the idea of trolling on the web, and how you can be anonymous and hijack a conversation, which allows what I believe it was Slate did an article about how trolling is actually a sociopathic tendency. So it has created this interesting way for anyone to not just be a journalist, but to have power in a weird sense. And now what they do with that and remain anonymous remains to be seen.
I'll answer this by thinking about, I heard when Dee started to ask a question about audience, and thinking about how you enter your voice into these realms. I think that's also related to this concept of anonymity, is this concept of tweeting and retweeting, and the idea that this message that might have been conceived going into one place is now going into a totally different place. And that decontextualization that happens is also very problematic in terms of culture, just to kind of sort through that. But it's related to what Diana was saying as well, because it's, if each one of us has a partial voice and a partial view of society, and we enter it into this sphere, you would think that the aggregate would add up. But one of the things that we theorize very strongly within communication studies is the difference between a collected group and a collective. Is that what you see is a collected group of statements, but it's not necessarily a collective shared understanding, and that's in context that we can appreciate. And I think that's two of the problems that I think emerge from when you think about the problem of anonymity and this diffusion and partiality of messaging on social media.
Nathan?
Yeah, so when you mentioned anonymity, I actually thought immediately of our Southwestern Confessions page, which students probably know very well. For anyone else who's here who doesn't know, it's an anonymous webpage that's been shut down like 3 or 4 times on Facebook, but has revived again, where students post anonymous confessions. And they can other students can like and comment, of course, not anonymously on those confessions. And one thing that I think might surprise some people, which is problematic as it is sometimes, as a student leader, I can tell you that, and as a leader of Student Congress, that we learned so much more about issues, and I felt so much more in tune with the student body when Confessions was up and running than when it went away, and I felt like it was pulling teeth. But I think because people could be anonymous, there was a sort of honesty maybe, and I don't know, sort of crowdsourced some of what we do, and it was good PR for Congress in some ways too, that when we were on there. So, but it obviously has a dark side, and I know Danielle probably has some experience with it, not to put you on the spot. And finally, the point about silos and about surrounding ourselves in sort of like an echo chamber online, I think is really interesting, and it sort of reinforces for me like how interesting I think Scott Simon's lecture is going to be. It's titled "Let Yourself Be Changed," is that right? And so I'm hoping he addresses that. I know he took an unpopular stance in supporting the war on terror as somebody who contributes to NPR, amongst other things. So I'm really excited for the lecture.
Paige.
I think that with regard to the silo question also, I'm not so sure that it's new. I really think that, at least in my little experience, people tend to like what they like and look for what they like. And I think that social media certainly heightens it and exploits it. But I think that even though there are all these promotional things that you can do and ways to customize it, ultimately you're in control of what you see. And so if you choose to silo yourself, that is a choice. And so I think that certainly it can be a positive resource for making interactions, as Danielle said. I mean, I've really challenged myself. My best friend, Eleanor O'Neill, has not opposite, but varying political views. And I learned so much by following her on Twitter. And that's a choice that I made because I knew that I needed to broaden my horizons. And then with regard, just social media in general, I think that there's this emphasis, and even I said it, that everyone's a journalist and everyone's responsible. But I think it only maximizes the actual importance of journalists who are committed to reporting news. And I'm not, everyone's like, oh, journalism's going away, the newspaper is dying, and I don't think so. I think that I just went to a conference where we saw all these interesting new platforms, and I really believe that journalist professionals are going to find a way to not monopolize, but to professionalize that venue. And I think it's just a growing field, and I hope to be a part of that. I think it's so important. There are a ton of voices, and if we can find a way to focus that voice so that we can look at social justice or global or even issues about just our basic humanity. I really think that's important, and I can't wait. I was very intimidated by social media, but now it seems really exciting, and I'm kind of glad to kind of live in this crazy moment. So,
Danielle.
Well, to speak to both of y'all's questions, I think that they're both problematic in a way, obviously. I mean, you're addressing that, but I think that it basically, in the framework of this lecture coming up, it means that we have a social responsibility to educate ourselves about how becoming anonymous or staying anonymous on social or choosing to only follow beliefs that you are aligned with yours. As parents, we need to start educating our children. As this generation grows up with a device in our hand, the conversations about what you do and how you be responsible with social media need to be, interwoven with all the other education they get. And so, one of the things I advocate for is like a life skills class. I think that social media needs to be a part of that and the role that you play in the bigger picture in the community and in the conversation. And so for me, it just kind of goes back to a bigger ethical question about everything and how we communicate. And you can choose to be good friends and only interact with one person face to face that believes what you, like you said, you choose to go outside of that comfort zone. And I think that we have to do that. And anonymity is part of all of that too, and there's ramifications, like you said, but there's also the good that comes with it. So it's just about having these conversations, things like this, and I'm going to have to say, because of Schilling Lecture, be sure you register to come to that, because if we don't know you're coming, then we can't have a seat for you. So.